name is John, and I used to be a skeptic. But one night changed everything. My friend James and I were driving back from a party when our car broke down near the abandoned Miller's Hospital, a decrepit building that had been closed for decades. It was rumored to be haunted, but we had no choice but to seek help there. The hospital loomed ominously as we approached. The front door creaked open with an eerie groan, and the air inside was stale and cold. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness as we navigated the maze of corridors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. As we ventured deeper, we stumbled upon a series of old, dusty patient records scattered across the floor. They detailed bizarre and gruesome surgeries performed by Dr. Frederick Hale, the notorious midnight surgeon. According to the records, Hale had experimented on his patients, performing unspeakable acts in the dead of night. The hospital was shut down after numerous patients disappeared, but Hale was never found. Suddenly, we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound, like metal against metal. We followed it, our hearts pounding. The sound led us to the old operating theater. The large double doors were slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered inside. We hesitated but pushed the doors open. The room was a macabre scene, with rusty surgical instruments scattered around and an old operating table at its center. On the table lay a figure in a tattered hospital gown, its face obscured. As we approached, the figure sat up abruptly, revealing a grotesque, half-decayed face. It was Dr. Hale, his hollow eyes fixed on us with an unnatural intensity. James and I froze in terror. Hale stood up slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural. He reached for a scalpel, and that's when we bolted. We raced down the corridors, the sound of Hale's footsteps echoing behind us. We could hear his raspy breaths getting closer, but we didn't dare look back. We burst through the front door and sprinted to our car. Miraculously, it started, and we sped away, leaving the hospital and its horrors behind. We went straight to the police, but when they investigated, the hospital was empty. There was no trace of Hale or the operating room we had seen. That night haunted me for years. I couldn't shake the image of Dr. Hale and his decayed face. It was only later that I discovered more about the midnight surgeon. There were countless reports of his ghost haunting the hospital, appearing to those who dared to enter. Each encounter was eerily similar to ours, with Hale chasing his victims but never catching them, almost as if he enjoyed the hunt. The hospital remains abandoned, a decaying monument to its dark past. People still report seeing a dim light in the operating theater at night and hearing the faint tapping of metal on metal. Some say the midnight surgeon is still there, waiting for his next victims. I've since moved away, but the memories linger. The fear, the chase, the horrific face of Dr. Hale, they are etched into my mind forever. I now know that some legends are terrifyingly real, and that night in Miller's Hospital will always be my chilling proof. Growing up in my quiet suburban neighborhood, there was always an unsettling urban legend about the Smiling Man. They said he was a tall, thin figure in an old-fashioned suit, always grinning an unnaturally wide smile. He only appeared at night, his smile never fading, no matter what. One night, after working a late shift at the local diner, I decided to walk home. The streets were eerily empty, and a thick fog had settled in. As I turned a corner, I saw him, standing under a flickering streetlight, his face pale and his smile impossibly wide. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I tried to ignore him, quickening my pace. But as I walked faster, so did he, his footsteps echoing mine. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run. I could hear his footsteps growing louder, closer. I glanced back, and he was sprinting after me, his smile unwavering. I ducked into an alley, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him outside, his footsteps slowing to a stop. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded. I peeked out, and he was gone. Relieved, I continued home, constantly looking over my shoulder. The next day, I told my friends about the encounter, but they laughed it off, saying it was just a prank or my imagination. But I knew what I saw. Over the next few weeks, there were more sightings of the Smiling Man. People reported seeing him on their late-night walks, always following, never speaking. Then, people started disappearing. The police were baffled, and the community was gripped by fear. One night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. I froze, dread washing over me. Slowly, I turned to see the smiling man standing outside, his grin even wider. He tapped again, his eyes locked onto mine. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After a few minutes, he vanished into the night, leaving me shaken and terrified. The disappearances continued, and the legend of the smiling man grew. Some said he was a spirit, others a man driven mad by his eternal smile. Whatever he was, one thing was certain: if you saw him, you were never the same. A few months later, the smiling man's legend took a darker turn. People began reporting not just sightings, but also hearing eerie, melodic humming late at night. It was as if the smiling man was calling to them, luring them out of their homes. Those who followed the sound were never seen again. The once peaceful streets became ghostly quiet after dark, as no one dared to venture out. The community was paralyzed with fear. I eventually moved away, but the memory of that terrifying night stayed with me. Even now, whenever I hear a faint hum or see a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, I am reminded of the smiling man and his ghastly, eternal grin. The legend lives on, a chilling reminder that some horrors are all too real. One stormy night, I was driving home from a late shift when I saw a figure on the side of the road, drenched and shivering. It was a young woman, her clothes tattered and soaked. Feeling sorry for her, I pulled over and offered her a ride. She climbed in silently, her eyes wide with fear. As we drove, she introduced herself as Lily and told me a chilling story. Her car had broken down, and she had been hitchhiking when a man picked her up. At first, he seemed kind, but his demeanor quickly changed. He became violent, and she barely escaped with her life. I assured her she was safe now and offered to take her to the nearest police station. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. As we approached the station, I glanced over to reassure her again, but she was gone. The seat was empty, and there was no sign she had ever been there. Confused and shaken, I continued to the station and reported the incident. The officer on duty listened carefully and then handed me a file. It contained reports of other drivers who had picked up a woman matching Lily's description. They all told the same story: she would appear, tell her harrowing tale, and then vanish before reaching safety. It turned out Lily was a hitchhiker who had been murdered years ago. Her body was never found, but her spirit continued to seek help, replaying the night of her death over and over. I had given a ride to a ghost, a restless soul unable to find peace. I avoided that stretch of highway after that, haunted by the memory of Lily and her tragic fate. The legend of the vanishing hitchhiker lived on, a chilling reminder that some souls are forever trapped in their final moments. Months later, I couldn't resist the urge to learn more about Lily. I visited the local library and delved into old newspapers and records. I found an article from the 1980s about a young woman named Lily Dawson, who had gone missing after her car broke down on that very stretch of road. The police had never solved her case, and her family had moved away in grief. One evening, I decided to visit the spot where I had picked her up. I brought a small bouquet of flowers and placed them by the roadside in her memory. As I stood there, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a faint, translucent figure watching me from the shadows. Her eyes seemed to convey a sense of gratitude and sorrow. Then, she was gone. From that day on, I made it a point to drive carefully on that road and always offered a silent prayer for Lily. I hoped that my gesture had brought her some peace. The encounters with the vanishing hitchhiker became less frequent, and some locals even believed that Lily's spirit had finally found rest. But I knew better: some stories never truly end, and some spirits never truly leave. My name is Maria, and this is the story of the night I encountered the Weeping Woman, a local legend in our small town in Brazil. It was a warm, humid evening, and I had just finished a late shift at the local hospital where I worked as a nurse. Exhausted, I decided to take the shortcut through the old forest road, a path seldom used after dark due to the numerous stories of supernatural occurrences. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy as I walked. The only sounds were the distant calls of night creatures and the crunch of leaves under my feet. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the air became, as if the forest itself was closing in on me. Despite the unease, I pressed on, eager to get home. Suddenly, I heard a faint sobbing sound. I stopped, straining to listen. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the trees. It sent chills down my spine, but my curiosity got the better of me. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I neared a small clearing, I saw her. She was sitting by the edge of a small, murky pond, her back to me. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her shoulders, and she wore a white dress that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Her shoulders shook with each sob. I hesitated, remembering the tales my grandmother used to tell me about the weeping woman. According to the legend, she was a young woman who had fallen in love with a handsome traveler. They were to be married, but on the day of their wedding, he never showed up. Heartbroken and humiliated, she wandered into the forest and drowned herself in the pond. Since then, her spirit was said to haunt the forest, weeping for her lost love and luring unsuspecting travelers to their doom. I knew I should leave, but something compelled me to approach her. "Are you all right?" I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped crying and slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids, and her face was twisted in anguish. Despite my fear, I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow for her. She whispered something I couldn't understand and then rose to her feet, gliding towards me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. As she drew closer, the temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath in the air. Her cold, bony hand reached out to touch my face, and I felt a surge of despair so intense that it brought me to my knees. Just then, I heard my name being called from a distance. It was my friend, Carlos, who had come looking for me after I hadn't returned his calls. His voice broke the spell, and the weeping woman recoiled, her form dissolving into the mist. I scrambled to my feet and ran towards Carlos, tears streaming down my face. Carlos took me home, and I told him everything. He listened patiently, his face growing more concerned with each word. He didn't dismiss my story as a figment of my imagination. He knew the legend well and had heard similar tales from other townsfolk. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the encounter from my mind. I felt a constant chill, and the sense of sorrow lingered. I decided to visit the local historian, Dona Rosa, who had a deep knowledge of the town's folklore. She listened to my story and nodded knowingly. "You've encountered the weeping woman," she said. "Her sorrow is eternal, and she seeks solace in the living. You must go back to the pond and offer her a token of peace." Following her advice, I returned to the forest with a white lily, a symbol of purity and peace. As I approached the pond, the air grew cold once more, and I could hear her faint sobbing. I knelt by the water's edge and gently placed the lily on its surface. "Rest in peace," I whispered, hoping she could hear me. The sobbing stopped, and for a moment, the forest was silent. Then, a soft breeze rippled the water, carrying the lily towards the center of the pond. I never saw the weeping woman again, but I often think of her and the sorrow that bound her spirit to this world. The forest, once a place of fear, became a place of reflection and remembrance. I shared my story with others, hoping to bring some peace to those who might encounter her in the future. Some nights, when the moon is full, I visit the pond and leave a lily, a small gesture to honor her memory. The legend of the weeping woman continues to haunt our town, a reminder of the pain of unfulfilled love and the power of compassion. And though her cries have faded, her presence lingers, a silent guardian of the forest she once called home.